other machines, machines gathering and analyzing data about experience and so forth, its operations largely bypass recognition by sense perception and attentional consciousness. The question that animates my explorations is thus, how can we account for the impact of this sub-perceptual operationality on our experience? Or put more generically, how can we account for the operation of sensibility that occurs independently from sense perception? My interest in neuroscience, which I should note predates today's event by more than a decade, centers on two of its discipline-defining features. First, its focus on the fine structure of neural processes that by definition lack direct perceptual correlates and that comprise an impersonal mode of sensing. And in a certain sense, I think this is really amazing that the more I was thinking, reading your papers and thinking about this claim that seems to me so huge in my field, right, that there's a kind of sensibility underneath perception that we don't perceive and so on and so forth, is something that is like elementary for what you're doing, right? So it's really a kind of a, you know, I'm among friends here more than I am in my humanities circles at home. Okay, the second discipline-defining feature that I want to focus on is its structural reliance, the structural reliance of neuroscience on what historian of science Henning Schmidtgen calls the cyborg apparatus of the laboratory setup. So I'm going to focus first on the first point, the impersonal mode of sensing and the sensibility beneath perception. So I should confess what is perhaps a certain idealization on my part of the neuroscientific enterprise, and we had this long discussion late into the night last night about the cultural specificity of perception and sensibility and whether there's a kind of generic sensation, and I guess I just believe there is, or I want to believe there is. Okay, so the idealization is this. What I see in neuroscientifically informed efforts at naturalization, and I'm thinking, for example, of Francisco Varela's late work, is a commitment to treat the brain as part of the material world, and thus to begin from a standpoint that precedes all of the separations that inform our inherited ontoepistemologies. Right? So brain, body, world, all of these things come after this very basic material belonging of the brain in the body or in the world as part of the world. Right? In this sense, what neuroscience can tell us about the brain and the mind differs in a categorical way from what philosophical accounts can tell us about the higher order operations of mentality, sense perception, attention, and introspection. Specifically, neuroscientific procedures access a level of operationality that in some sense precedes the organization imposed by the human body-mind on sensory data of experience. For this reason, assuming that my naive sense is right here, neuroscience is not only perfectly situated to aid my own efforts to access sensibility outside of perception, but is, as a discipline, already dedicated to the notion that experience vastly exceeds the scope of philosophical models of perception. Another way to put this, and I learned this in part from thinking about Semir Zeki's account of the differential timeframes for various operations of visual sensation, is that rather than assuming system integration at the outset, which seems to be what philosophy does even when it's trying to explain synthesis or whatever, neuroscience seeks to explain its emergence, the emergence of integration, from more primordial operations of the brain. Thus, for Zeki, the simultaneity characteristic of visual perception, the fact that we perceive an integrated visual percepta, right, or sensation, results from an operational overlap of quasi-autonomous processes or microprocesses, or he even calls them at one point micro-consciousnesses, which I really like, for sensing orientation, color, location, and so on, right? So each of these separate activities has its own temporal frame, and it's when and where they overlap that we have a visual sensation. So the second feature, the irreducibility of the technical setup of any brain time experiment, informs my efforts to supplement human phenomenal consciousness by way of the data gathering and analytical capacities of today's computational sensing networks. Right? And in a sense, all I'm doing is simply saying we have, with our computers and our sensing systems and sensors in the environment and recording of traces of our activity and so on, we have this treasure trove of information about our own sensible existence in the world. We cannot access it perceptually. We don't have any perceptual access to it. We can only access it through this technical circuit that the computational system provides us, right, as data about our own experience, right? So we have to take a third-person standpoint on our own first-person experience in order to access this. Because our access to the subperceptual operations of neural processes requires a technical circuit, for example, a brain inside an fMRI scanner, we gain access to these processes via the presentification of data about first-person experience to a third-person observer, whether that's us or somebody else, a scientist. In my understanding of Benjamin Libet's pioneering studies of the missing half-second, the so-called missing half-second, I have focused on the temporal delay between neural activation and attention as constitutive not simply for the correlation between brain activity and mentality, but more fundamentally for the experience of mentality as such. Because the human perceiver is temporally separated from the neural basis of her perceptual experience, right? We don't intuit what's going on neurally in our brains. She cannot directly intuit or experience this neural basis. On the contrary, it can only be relayed after the fact, right? Or as I put it in my book, in the title of my book, fed forward, right? Into what, from the standpoint of the event at issue, can only be a future moment of her conscious awareness. With respect to the philosophical sources dear to my work, what this means that the animating dream of phenomenology, Husserl's dream that time consciousness can coincide with its own occurrence, right? That it could intend itself in the very happening. This dream can only remain a dream, right? The irreducible temporal gap separating neural processing from any resultant perceptual experience not only ensures against such phenomenological coincidence, but institutes the technical or feed-forward circuit linking brain operationality and phenomenological experience as an essential and non-eliminable account of this larger experiential circuit. Put bluntly, there simply is no accessible relationality between neural operationality and resulting mentality in the absence of the actually functioning experimental setup that affords the experimenter access to what lies outside her perceptual grasp. Cultural critics like Brian Masumi or Nigel Thrift, who have taken up the missing half-second in their own work, are, in my opinion, mistaken when they act as if the domain of neural operationality, thus accessed, can be marshaled as a new frontier for expanded human agency. For if it is the case that our access to the domain of brain relations can, in fact, expand our agency, and I argue in my own book that it does expand our agency, human attunement, let me try that again. If it is the case that access to the domain of brain operations can in fact expand our agency, such expansion, I argue, can only occur as an indirect expansion, as an embodied human attunement to the sensory operationality of the world and of our contact with the world that evades perceptual presentification and that can only be relayed to consciousness and can only make a difference to consciousness as and in the form of data of sensibility. So I provide these details of my relationship to neuroscience not simply to advertise myself and show off my new work, but rather to give a context for clarifying why I've been so moved by Professor Galese's efforts to shift the very terrain of the encounter of neuroscience with sensory experience and aesthetics. Right, and I really think that, I've read Ramachandran and Semir Zeki and so on, and I really think that the kind of work that you're doing and the path that you're tracing out is a very different approach, and we've already talked about this, that taps into a lot of the things that I'm really interested in relation to media and that I think media is making salient for us as well at this moment. So by this, I mean, of course, Galese's installation of the sensory motor domain, and specifically of the simulation of sensory motor processes at the very heart of the encounter of neuroscience and aesthetics. And I quote from Galese, I employed the term simulation, this is in his paper Embodied Simulation, as an automatic, unconscious, and pre-reflexive functional mechanism whose function is the modeling of objects, agents, and events. Simulation is therefore not necessarily the result of a willed and conscious cognitive effort aimed at interpreting the intentions hidden in the overt behavior of others, but rather a basic functional mechanism of our brain. Simulation represents the outcome of a possible action, emotion, or sensation one could take or experience, and it serves to attribute this outcome to another organism as a real goal state it is trying to bring about, or as a real emotion or sensation it is experiencing. There are many aspects of Galese's account that are worthy of consideration, but for my purposes here, two of them are the most crucial. First, the key role accorded sensory motor processes, as contrasted with more static accounts like Zecchi's that focus on the coordination of the components of visual perception. So this focus on sensory motor processes effectively installs embodiment as the mediator between neural operationality and behavior. As I shall suggest shortly, it is a small step from this move to my own understanding of embodiment as a properly technical exaptation, a redirection of a biologically and evolutionarily achieved capacity to novel demands of cultural or technical environments. And the second aspect of Galese's work that is important for me is the emphasis that he places on the potentiality of simulation, on the fact that simulations are most frequently simulations of possible actions. So this emphasis on the possibility or the potentiality of simulation forges an envelopment or an invagination, to use these ambiguous terms of Merleau-Ponty's, between body and world that again expresses much, much more than a facility or capacity of the body, that expresses what, with Whitehead, we can call the real potentiality of the entire worldly sensibility at issue in the given situation. Right? So it's not just information about the body separated from the world, it's information about the entire sensory situation in which the body is the mediator, in a certain sense, right, or the privileged mediator. When, in the process of embodied simulation, embodiment selects from a repertoire of potential simulations of sensory motor actions, it selects not solely or primarily in virtue of the capacities of the body or the body-mind, but in virtue of the entirety of the sensory situation and its demands, right? And in a sense, even this distinction of the body proper from the sensory situation that it's in doesn't hold up, right? Doesn't make sense, right? It's in this giant situation, and the body is the access onto all of the dimensions of sensibility involved there, and the embodied simulation is responding to that entirety of a situation rather than just something coming from inside it. So I want to just spend the rest of my time talking about, trying to concretize these 2 points, the point about the technicity of embodiment and the point about the potentiality of sensibility. And to do so, I want to focus on 2 of Galese's key arguments and discuss a little bit how they resonate with some radical developments in Merleau-Ponty and Whitehead. And in a way, it gave me a chance to go back and reread my account of Merleau-Ponty in my book, Bodies and Code, which I also recently reread a little bit, teaching it to my class. And trying to, it's always strange to read what you've written 9 years ago and try to figure out what was I doing then and so on. But it was basically a pretty good experience. It was okay. But I have some more thoughts now about Merleau-Ponty that are better than what I thought before because of thinking about it in this way. So the first argument I want to talk about is the argument about touch. And the claim, this claim that Galese, following Husserl, makes about touch's superiority to vision, right? And I want to, in a certain sense, put the brakes on and say, not so fast, I think. So Galese's account of embodied simulation culminates in a crucial claim about touch and its priority over vision. Unlike vision, which requires the mapping of the outside world as a three-dimensional spatiality at a remove from the first-person perspective, touch and sensory motor operations generally interface the mapping of an objective world with the subjective experience of the immanence of one's own body within that same world, right? And Whitehead also speaks about, he tries to expand perception beyond sense perception, and he speaks about the withness of the body, right? And we have an inkling of this expanded dimension of perception when we're really tired and we feel our eyes being tired, and we know at that moment we see with our eyes, right? We're not seeing something out there, we see with our eyes. We have an awareness of the bodily basis of the perception. Or when we touch ourselves, we touch with our hands, right? So it's very similar to Merleau-Ponty in some ways. So let's see, where am I here? Drawing on Husserl's account of touch in Ideas 2, Galese suggests that the kind of knowledge afforded by tactile experience gives us access to the inner sense of the experience of others. Precisely because of its difference from vision, touch thus provides what Galese takes to be a solution to the problem of other minds or intersubjectivity that dogged Husserl's phenomenology both during his own career and in its aftermath. Touch, Galese states, and I quote, has a privileged status in making possible the social attribution of a live personhood to others, the full appreciation of others as persons like us depends on the involvement of body-related first-person tactile experiential knowledge. Touch, however, and it is important to be very careful here, cannot actually put us in touch with the inner sense or content of other minds, insofar as this is understood to be the achievement of phenomenological reduction and the intentional relationship left in its wake, right? So long as we understand the inner sense of another mind as the lived contents of that consciousness, right, we can't get in touch with that. We can't be in touch with that. Insofar as the lived contents of consciousness are the product of a particular consciousness undergoing a singular experience, these contents remain and can only remain private and inaccessible to other minds. So this requires, in my opinion, us to be specific about what touch does, right? So what I want to say that touch can do is to give us an experience of the other as an embodied mind capable of tactile experience and bound to the world through the primary tactility of sensibility. If we can say with Galese that the embodied simulation of touch experiences can give a direct experience of the other, it is a direct experience of the other as a generic being, as a being immanent to a common material world, a being itself capable of embodied simulation. In this respect, Husserl's account of touch in Ideas 2 and Galese's development of it does not so much solve the problem of intersubjectivity as he himself posed it, for example, in the Fifth Cartesian Meditation, as it does shift the terrain of the problem itself. And on this score, Galese's work provides a fascinating account of how each body-mind is bound to other body-minds and to the world as such through a form of empathy that is not ideational, but that is resolutely material. The sharing of a common worldly sensibility by humans understood as generic beings thus forms the basis for higher-order accounts of being with others, including Husserl's own ideational account of empathy. I want, however, to put pressure on one aspect of Galese's account that seems to me to unduly limit the scope of his revolutionary understanding of embodied simulation. What I have in mind here is the emphasis he places on the simultaneity of the double sensation involved in, and indeed peculiar to touch. Immediately following the passage I cited above, Galese continues as such, and I quote, "The dual nature of our own body as the sensing subject and the sensed object of our perceptions enables the constitution of other living humans as understandable persons. The body simultaneously perceived as an external object and as an experiential subject grounds within the same substrate made of flesh the sense of experiential personhood we attribute to others." On this topic of simultaneity and non-simultaneity of touching and touched, Merleau-Ponty stands opposed to Husserl. For Merleau-Ponty, there is, between any two-sided instance of sensibility, whether this be touching touched, seeing seen, feeling felt, and so on, there is an ineliminable gap, or what he calls an écart. Whatever coincidence is indeed marked by the structure of double sensation, it cannot be a coincidence of simultaneity. In a brilliant recent reading of Merleau-Ponty's final ontology, Emmanuel Aloa contends that not only does Merleau-Ponty restore the parallelism between vision and touch that Husserl, as he puts it, ruined, but Merleau-Ponty does this precisely to overcome the incipient dualities from very elementary ones like passivity-activity all the way to higher order ones like subject and object that cannot but come in the wake of the écart, conceptualized as an irreducible divide between sensing instances. Put another way, Merleau-Ponty restores the parallelism of vision and touch in order to institute a model of non-coincidence that does not remain rooted in an external distinction, a distance or separation between instances of sensing, but that probes more deeply into the structure of sensing itself. Rather than resulting from separation or distance, non-coincidence is quote, at the very heart of the experience of the sensing sensed. And it's a fairly long quote from Aloa. Against a philosophy of pure archie-presence, such as it is sketched out in the Husserlian description of the touching touched body, Merleau-Ponty accords it the characteristic of vision, which is to say of the constitutive gap between seeing and the visible. vision, and he's citing Merleau-Ponty, is not a certain mode of thought or self-presence. It is the means that is given to me of being absent from myself, of attending from within to the fission of being. And now Aloha continues. When he conceptualizes the flesh as visibility par excellence, it is thus the very opposite of a return to a heliotropic thinking of immediate givenness. On the contrary, it sketches out an ontology of absence in presence, of inherence in distance. What I think Aloha is seeking here is an expression of the fundamental mediatedness of the primordial experience of double sensation that for Merleau-Ponty, as well as for Husserl, comprises the basis of embodied life, and that for Gallese comprises the crux of embodied simulation. Because the écart is not a gap between two terms, is not simply a gap between a sensing body and a sensed body, but is rather a constitutive doubleness of the mode of being of sensibility as such. It informs a structure that is in some sense pre-empirical, a transcendental structure of worldly sensibility in virtue of which actual experiences of double sensation can occur. In my book, Bodies in Code, I sought to expand Merleau-Ponty's body schema beyond the bounds of his understanding of technological prostheses and to theorize a primordial technicity at the heart of human being. Adapting that framework to the current occasion, I would reaffirm the technicity of embodiment, but would now situate the operation of technicity as a primordial dimension of embodiment itself, where embodiment is understood in a generic sense as the informing of sensibility. Put another way, I would now turn to embodiment as the very mediation at work in the empirical experience of double sensation. On this score, Gallese's understanding of embodied simulation as an acceptation of sensory motor processes can and should be generalized beyond the instance of concrete events of double sensing, and particularly of touching touched, and it can and should be conceptualized beyond the operation and figure of simultaneity. What we discover in so proceeding is that Merleau-Ponty's flesh, that enigmatic concept designating the sensibility of the world itself beyond any particular act of sensing, as well as the particular sensibility of human body minds, that flesh is the general medium for all sensory experience, understood as double sensation. The flesh is a third term, a medium, linking the sensing to the sensed in a relation that is neither one of reciprocity nor of simultaneity, but one of incongruity and temporal discordance. In short, in a relation that effectuates and sustains the body-mind's radical openness to the world. Today's computational technologies, including, perhaps exemplarily, the technologies facilitating the kind of research Gallese and his lab carry out, affords us powerful means to access the components of this non-totalizable process, and in so doing, allows us to bring it into the purview of our analytical, though always after the fact, experience. Gallese's research, that is, brings the results of first-person sensory motor simulation into the purview of a third-person observational stance. In so doing, it vastly expands our access to what is actually going on underneath our perceived experience. Just as it would be a mistake to stop our analysis at the seeming simultaneity between sensing and sense, which would overlook the necessity of the technical circuit I have sought to explore here, of the very technicity of embodiment itself. So just as that would be a mistake, so too would it be a mistake to overlook the non-trivial role played by the technical access to a domain of sensibility that normally, and as it were in real time, simply evades our perceptual discernment. What looms on the horizon for me is the question of how these two aspects of technicity, the technicity of generic embodiment and the essential role played by data in the cyborg assemblage of the neuroscientific experiment, and I think increasingly in the cyborg assemblage of our everyday lives as we walk around with these things and we use these things and so on, that the question is whether these two sides of the technicity of embodiment and the technicity of our cyborg lives, in fact, comprise two sides of yet another écart. Okay, and then my second point, so I said I was going to explore two aspects of Gallese's work. The second one is the notion of the trace. And what I would have written if I had had time, thank you again, would be something along these lines. I was very taken with the way in which, in the paper that he was discussing at the end of his talk on Lucio Fontana's artworks, the way in which the gesture that makes the artwork, which is a paradigmatic example of a trace, right? And it goes back a little bit to what you were saying about memory and then forward directedness, right? That it's a trace that's no longer simply a trace of an experience that has vanished. It's a trace that is potentially full of the motor neural simulation that our embodied relation to it brings about, right? So it's an understanding of the trace as a potentiality for activation, right? And I would link this to, Whitehead's understanding of real potentiality.
Very much on there because I was notified about the workshop 1 or 2 months ago, and I already had full administration later. So, but enjoy the
mini paper, which I think makes us already into the